My mother told the entire family I abandoned my baby to go partying. Unaware, I showed up at Sunday brunch with the neighbor. She paid to watch him while she was at a spa. My mother told the entire family that I had completely abandoned my toddler for the weekend to go out partying, using it as proof that I was an unfit, reckless parent who needed to be forced back under her roof. She thought she had staged the perfect emergency by volunteering to babysit and then dumping my child with a neighbor to trigger a family crisis. Instead of screaming at her over the phone, I quietly collected my child, secured the physical proof, and walked straight into the weekly family brunch to let her own witness dismantle her lie. My name is Avery. I am 23 years old, and for the past 2 years, my life has been defined by a single, unyielding goal: independence. I am a young single mother to my 2-year-old son, Leo. When Leo was born, my mother, Diane, immediately tried to take total control of my life. She wanted me to move back into her house, surrender my autonomy, and allow her to raise Leo as if he were her own second chance at parenting. Diane is a woman obsessed with control and community standing, used to dictating the terms of every relationship in our family. When I refused her offer, rented a tiny suburban apartment on my own, and took a grueling, entry-level job at a local logistics firm, she viewed it as a personal insult. For months, Diane quietly predicted my failure to anyone who would listen. She constantly dropped passive-aggressive comments about how my apartment was too small, how my hours were too long, and how a young woman my age simply couldn't handle the structural weight of real-world responsibilities. But I was handling it. In fact, I was thriving. I had spent 6 months saving up for a specialized logistics certification course, an intense 48-hour weekend seminar that would guarantee me a massive promotion and a significant salary increase at my firm. The problem was childcare. The seminar took place over a full Saturday and Sunday, requiring 12 hours of focus each day. When my usual daycare fell through at the last minute due to a building maintenance issue, I felt a wave of absolute panic. That was when Diane stepped in, offering a sudden, unusual olive branch. "Avery, let me take Leo for the weekend," Diane had said over the phone, her voice dripping with artificial maternal warmth. "I know how much this promotion means to you. Let me do my duty as a grandmother. Drop him off Friday night, focus entirely on your exams, and pick him up Sunday evening. Let's put our differences aside for his future." I felt an immense sense of relief. I thanked her profusely, believing that despite her toxic tendencies, her love for her grandson was genuine. I dropped Leo off at her house on Friday evening, along with his favorite toys, his specific meals, and a detailed schedule of his routine. I kissed him goodbye, drove to the seminar center, and immersed myself entirely in my coursework. The illusion shattered at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning. I woke up early to review my final notes before the last session, only to find my phone flooded with 20 missed calls and a barrage of vitriolic text messages from my aunts, uncles, and cousins. I opened a message from my Aunt Eleanor, which read, "Avery, how could you be so incredibly selfish? Leaving your helpless baby on your mother's doorstep without a word just to go out drinking in the city? Your mother is completely devastated. We are all deeply disgusted by your behavior." My stomach wrenched in absolute horror. I immediately called Diane, but my calls went straight to voicemail. I then called my cousin Mia, who was the only relative who usually stayed out of the family drama. Mia picked up, her voice tight with discomfort. She revealed the devastating narrative Diane had spent the last 24 hours systematically spreading through the family network. According to Diane, I had dropped Leo off on Friday night, looked her in the eye, and announced that I was sick of being a mother, was leaving the state for a wild weekend party, and didn't care what happened to my child. Diane claimed she was so overwhelmed and physically exhausted by the sudden abandonment that she had been forced to seek emergency help from the community. It was a terrifyingly calculated character assassination designed to ruin my reputation overnight, justify a legal custody intervention, and force me to surrender my independence out of sheer public shame. I stood in my apartment, my hands shaking, but as the initial shock faded, a cold, analytical clarity took its place. I knew that if I reacted with explosive emotion, if I drove to Diane's house screaming and banging on the door, I would play right into the narrative she had constructed. The family would see a hysterical, aggressive young woman, and Diane would play the calm, weeping victim who was just trying to protect a child. I needed to find out where Leo actually was, and I needed hard, undeniable evidence before Diane could alter the chessboard. I knew Diane's personal habits. She had a mandatory Sunday morning routine. She attended church at 9 a.m., followed immediately by the weekly family brunch at 11 a.m. at the Central Country Club, where the entire extended family gathered. If she claimed she was overwhelmed and babysitting an abandoned child, she wouldn't have brought Leo to a formal family brunch. I called Mrs. Gable, an elderly, retired nurse who lived directly next door to my mother. Mrs. Gable had known me since I was a child and was an honest, no-nonsense woman who detested neighborhood gossip. When Mrs. Gable answered the phone, I kept my voice entirely calm and steady. I asked her if she had seen my mother or Leo. "Oh, Avery, sweetie, Leo is right here with me," Mrs. Gable said, her voice completely relaxed. "Your mother dropped him off at my house on Friday night at 7 p.m., barely 10 minutes after you drove away. She paid me $200 in cash to watch him until Sunday afternoon, telling me she had a private spa weekend booked at the resort downtown and didn't want the noise. Is everything all right?" A wave of cold fury washed over me, immediately followed by absolute validation. Diane hadn't been overwhelmed. She hadn't suffered an emergency. She had deliberately dropped my son off with a paid neighbor the exact moment I left, explicitly so she could spend the weekend calling the family, crying, and fabricating a crisis out of thin air while she sat at a luxury spa. I told Mrs. Gable the entire truth. The line went silent for a moment as the retired nurse processed the sheer malice of Diane's plot. Mrs. Gable's voice turned to absolute steel. She told me to come over immediately. When I arrived at Mrs. Gable's house, Leo was happily eating breakfast in the kitchen, completely safe and unharmed. I hugged my son tightly, holding back tears of relief. Mrs. Gable then walked over to her desk, took out a piece of official stationery, and wrote a comprehensive physical statement. It detailed the exact time Diane dropped Leo off, the cash payment, the explicit lie Diane told her about the spa weekend, and Mrs. Gable's own contact information and signature. "Take this, Avery," Mrs. Gable said firmly, handing me the paper. "But don't just show them a piece of paper. I'm coming with you. I've known your mother for 20 years, and it's time she faces the reality of what she's done." I looked at the physical statement, then at Mrs. Gable. The trap was fully reversed. Diane had built a masterpiece of a lie, completely forgetting that the people she used as pawns had their own voices. We loaded Leo into the car seat, Mrs. Gable climbed into the passenger side, and we drove directly toward the country club where the family brunch was already underway. We arrived at the country club at exactly 11:30 a.m. The grand dining hall was filled with affluent local families, the atmosphere bright and cheerful. I spotted the long central family table near the garden windows. My mother, Diane, was seated at the center, surrounded by my aunts, uncles, and cousins. As I approached, I could hear her voice carrying over the low hum of the room. She was leaning forward, a linen handkerchief pressed to her eyes, delivering a dramatic, tearful update to her sisters. "I just don't know where I went wrong with her," Diane sobbed softly, her voice dripping with performative heartbreak. "To just walk out on her own flesh and blood. I've been up all night sick with worry, trying to keep things together while she's out God knows where. I fear we'll have to step in legally to save that poor boy." My Aunt Eleanor was rubbing Diane's back, shaking her head in deep disgust. The rest of the table sat in somber, angry agreement. I walked directly up to the head of the table, holding Leo firmly in my arms, with Mrs. Gable standing silently right behind me. The moment my shadow fell across the white tablecloth, the conversation stopped instantly. Aunt Eleanor looked up, her eyes widening in shock. Diane's head snapped up, the fake tears evaporating from her eyes within a single second. Her face turned a stark, ash gray as her gaze shifted from me to the healthy child in my arms, and finally to her own next-door neighbor standing by my side. "Avery?" Eleanor stammered, standing up. "What are you doing here? How dare you show your face after what, Aunt Eleanor?" I interrupted, my voice clear, level, and entirely devoid of fear. I spoke loudly enough that several neighboring tables turned to look. After I completed the professional certification course that I've been studying for every night for 6 months, the course that my mother explicitly volunteered to watch Leo for, Diane tried to scramble, her social mask slipping as she stood up, her voice rising in a sharp, desperate hiss. "Avery, stop this immediately. Don't you dare bring your garbage behavior into public. We are having a private family discussion. Leave the room." "No, Diane, we're having a public exposure," I said, dropping the formal title completely. I took Mrs. Gable's written statement and placed it flat on the table directly in front of my Uncle Richard, the oldest and most respected member of the family. "Uncle Richard, please read that statement aloud to the table." Richard adjusted his glasses, picked up the paper, and read Mrs. Gable's distinct handwriting. As his eyes scanned the lines detailing the Friday night drop-off, the $200 cash payment, and the fake spa weekend story, his expression hardened into absolute iron. Before Diane could invent an excuse, Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her voice ringing out with absolute medical authority. "Every word on that paper is the truth." "Diane," Mrs. Gable said, looking my mother dead in the eye, "you dropped this sweet boy off at my house 10 minutes after his mother left. You told me you were going to a luxury resort downtown. You didn't spend the night crying crying or worried. You spent it at a spa while you used your grandson as a prop to destroy your own daughter's life. You ought to be deeply ashamed of yourself. The weight of the physical evidence and the direct live testimony crashed into the family table like a sledgehammer. There was no digital message to debate, no misunderstanding to hide behind. The timeline proved that Diane had systematically engineered a fake child abandonment crisis out of pure, malicious intent to control my life. Uncle Richard dropped the paper back onto the table, looking at Diane with profound disgust. You fabricated a child emergency to ruin your own daughter's name, Diane? In front of your own sisters? You used a toddler as a pawn? Aunt Eleanor slowly took her hand off Diane's back, stepping away from her as if she were toxic. The aunts and cousins who had spent the morning pitying Diane were now staring at her with absolute horror. Diane realized her social standing within the family was completely obliterated. She opened her mouth to scream at Mrs. Gable, but saw only cold, unyielding disgust from every single relative at the table. Realizing there was no lie big enough to save her, she grabbed her designer handbag, pushed her chair back violently, and hurried out of the dining hall, keeping her head down as she fled into the parking lot. The brunch didn't stop, but the power dynamic changed forever. Uncle Richard stood up, walked over to me, and apologized deeply on behalf of the family for believing the gossip, promising that they would never allow Diane's words to influence them again. My relatives spent the rest of the afternoon celebrating my upcoming career promotion, fully unified in their support. Since that Sunday, Diane has been officially and permanently cut off from my life and my son's life. She remains entirely isolated on the absolute outside of the family network, exposed forever by the neighbor she thought she could use.